The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Ms. Najat Rochdi, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Syria. Ms. Edam Wosornu, Director, Operations and Advocacy Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and Ms. Sorsan Abu Zainuddin, Chief Executive Officer of Madaniya. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Najat Rochdi.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor to brief the Security Council on behalf of the Special Envoy Pedersen, who is in Syria at present and will meet the Syrian government in the coming days. The Special Envoy Pedersen was in Astana last week for meetings with the interlocutors who meet in the Astana format. He has since been in the region for a wide range of high-level contacts. Mr. President, an increasing number of Syrians find themselves trapped in an unrelenting cycle of violence and suffering, forced to flee from places of refuge now under attack, both within their homeland and beyond its borders. As humanitarian aid diminishes and hostile rhetoric and actions intensify, Syrians are being driven into increasingly precarious and unsustainable conditions. Clearly, the immediate priority for Syria is de-escalation. The country is being battered by the relentless storms of regional conflicts, by the rising waves of conflict within its own borders. This year is well on track to be the most violent since 2020, and the potential for even greater devastation looms on the horizon. Decisive action by all with influence is needed to prevent Syria being further swept into a broader conflagration. Once again, Israeli airstrikes on Syria have increased significantly, both in frequency and scope. Just yesterday, we saw thousands killed in a strike near Palmyra, likely the deadliest Israeli strike in Syria to date. Israel says its strikes address targets linked to Iran, Hezbollah, or Palestine Islamic Jihad. But once again, we have seen civilian casualties, including from significant strikes, were conducted on residential areas in the heart of Damascus. Civilian infrastructure was also hit, including bridges, roads, civilian and formal and informal border crossings, in some instances for the third time. This has further hindered the passage of civilians fleeing violence in Lebanon and also caused serious disruptions to essential import and export, now down by 40 to 50%. The prices of gasoline and basic goods have risen precipitously, leaving the most vulnerable in a precarious state. On the Golan as well, we are concerned about the volatile situation owing to continued violations of the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement. Under-Secretary General Lacroix will be briefing you in further detail next month. But let me echo the Secretary General's call on the parties to respect the terms of the agreements and prevents any further escalation across the ceasefire line. We have also seen reports of a rocket and some drone attacks from Syrian territory into the occupied Syrian Golan. Syrian state media says Syrian air defenses have also intercepted Israeli missiles in some instances. In parallel, the US carried out strikes against what is said are Iran-backed militias in response to armed drone attacks on its bases in northeast Syria. Meanwhile, since last briefing, northeast Syria has seen its most serious escalation during 2024 after a terrorist attack near Ankara on 23rd October resulted in civilian casualties. Turkey carried out strikes inside Syria for several days against what they stated were PKK-YPG targets. These strikes resulted in civilian casualties and severely impacted or damaged critical civilian infrastructure. The SDF claimed to have killed Turkish soldiers in attack on Turkish positions in Syria, with further reports of civilian areas hit by SDF rocket strikes. Violence remains at troubling levels in many other theaters too. Northwest Syria faces a worrying uptick in pro-government drone and artillery attacks, alongside many attacks involving Security Council-listed terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This new round of violence has also resulted in civilian casualties, new waves of displacement, and damage to civilian infrastructure. In the south, Daraa too has continued to experience significant instability. Moreover, attacks by Security Council-listed terrorist group ISIL have been increasing in the central desert region. Clearly, Mr. President, there is an urgent need for ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon, and for respect for the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria, and indeed, all states in the region. Alongside regional de-escalation, there is an urgent need to work towards a nationwide ceasefire in Syria in line with Security Council Resolution 2254 and a cooperative approach to combating Security Council-listed terrorist groups. I reiterate the Secretary General call on all parties to respect their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, as applicable. Let me also forcefully condemn all attacks we have seen posing harm to civilian and civilian infrastructures. Mr. President, UNHCR reports that over 500,000 people have fled Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon and crossed into Syria since late September, and there remains a steady flow of movements. Some 63% are Syrian, and most of them are women and children. We repeat our hope that all stakeholders understand that this is a critical moment to act responsibly and constructively on protection and livelihood concerns. On protection, all Syrians must be protected wherever they are. Those who remain outside, those recent arrivals, mostly under adverse conditions, and those who remained in the country throughout the conflict. We echo once again High Commissioner Grandi's appreciation for the Syrian government keeping the borders open for all and simplifying procedures and allowing UNHCR monitoring presence on the borders. The safety and security of all of those arriving from Lebanon must be ensured, both at the crossing and thereafter as they move throughout Syria by all authorities and de facto authorities. We hope to see progress on the full range of protection concerns. The more the United Nations and other actors are able to be present and active on the ground, the more confidence it will instill. On livelihood, let us remember, even before the latest influx of 500,000 people, 16.7 million Syrians were already in need of humanitarian assistance, the highest number recorded since the conflict began. I thank all donors who have provided support and stress that donors must give more, both for the emergency humanitarian appeal and for early recovery activities in all areas of Syria. Both approaches are essential and mutually supportive. One is not a replacement for the other. Here, let me also note that the UN and its partners have just launched an early recovery strategy for 2024 to 2028 to support building long-term resilience and address the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the country. And let me also flag the critical importance of the active engagement of sanctioning states to mitigate any adverse effects of sanctions, particularly in the form of overcompliance. Let me also welcome the government of Syria's decision to extend for a further 3-month permission for the UN to use Bab al-Salam and Al-Ra'i border crossings, which remains critical to reach those in need in northwest Syria. Mr. President, Syria remains in a profound and active state of war and division. Many millions of Syrians are still outside their country or struggling to survive in a complex landscape of de facto authorities, foreign armies, armed non-state actors, and listed terrorist groups. Over 100,000 remain arbitrarily detained or missing. The economy is in tatters and infrastructure is destroyed and degraded. Organized crime and illicit activities are on the rise, with negative social impact and generating even further instability. After almost 14 years of war and conflict, there are no quick fix technocratic solutions to these challenges, which are deeply political. These challenges also speak to the direct involvement as well as security concerns of regional and international players. Tackling these issues requires a meaningful political process in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. This is a pivotal moment to move the political process forward with genuine commitment and action. Geopolitical winds may soon start shifting once again in directions that are hard to predict. If all sides signal regions to act constructively, responsibly, and practically, then we have the best chance to harness existing and new dynamics into opportunities for progress. What does this mean in practice? One signal would be the resumption of constitutional committee meeting. The special envoy had in-depth discussion on this during the Astana talks and in the region, and looks forward to consultations with the Syrian government in the coming days, and also with the opposition Syrian Negotiation Commission. This will send a clear message that the framework for the political process remains alive and operational, and that there is a Syrian government and opposition whose nominees are able to sit together and address the critical issues at the heart of the intra-Syrian conflict. Another signal could be to further develop step-for-step confidence-building measures in light of the ideas on the table and bearing in mind the development on the ground and diplomatically. But at this moment, all Syrian and international players can and should really be thinking bigger, sending a signal that they are willing to put all the critical issues and concerns on the table. The Syrian political issues at the heart of conflict, but also the issues pertaining to protection, sovereignty, security, economy, and sanctions detainees and missing, refugees, and so on, issues which can only be fully addressed with external players. The Special Envoy has been sharing ideas on how to develop a comprehensive path out of these conflicts. Engagement on these ideas will be a strong signal at a time of potential change that a negotiated political solution on Syria, in line with Resolution 2254, is not beyond our collective ingenuity and political will. Mr. President, we of course will continue our engagement with Syrian civil society. As you heard from a civil society support room participant last month on behalf of many Syrian civil society actors, and as we keep hearing from the Women's Advisory Board too, there is a strong desire within Syrian communities for a political process that brings genuine reconciliation. Civil society must have a voice in that process. Here, let me once again encourage all Syrian parties to ensure that Syrian women have a seat at the table. This remains a key element in building a resilient peace and sustainable future for Syria, as we heard in the recent Security Council session on women building peace in a changing environment. Mr. President, in closing, let me reiterate the Special Envoy's appeal to all parties to de-escalate the military situation, both in the region and within Syria, and prioritize the protection and support of Syrian civilians, including those crossing back. We also call on Syrian and international stakeholders to work with the Special Envoy to reinvigorate the political process and also demonstrate a readiness to engage on the full scope of issues necessary for a comprehensive resolution. This is a time of profound uncertainty and danger in the region. It is also exactly the time to shape a path to allow the Syrian people to realize their legitimate aspirations, to restore Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity, and to safeguard peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Rochdi for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Edam Wosornu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, today I will address three key issues. First, the ongoing humanitarian impact on Syria of escalating regional conflict, including the continued influx of people from Lebanon. Second, the compounding effect on existing humanitarian needs and pressures at a time when over two-thirds of people in Syria are already in need of vital humanitarian assistance. And third, the heightened need for humanitarian funding and working in ways that maximize resources. Since I last briefed the Security Council in October, hostilities in Lebanon have continued to drive thousands of people across the border into Syria every day. We welcome the ongoing willingness of the government of Syria to keep its borders open and facilitate their entry. At the same time, continued airstrikes along the border have made this crossing more dangerous and challenging, as you've just heard from the Deputy Special Envoy. Damage from airstrikes means that vehicles can no longer traverse 2 of the 5 official border crossings. This includes the main Dedet-Yabuz crossing in rural Damascus, through which half of the arrivals to date have come, and the UCA crossings in Homs. People, including women, children, and other vulnerable groups, have resorted to navigating the crossing on foot or seeking out longer and riskier alternative routes. Airstrikes near the UCA border crossing in Al-Qusair have landed close to UNHCR facilities and in one case damaged the UNHCR border post at UCA. Another strike in the Shamsin area damaged the Damascus-Homs road. Civilian casualties also continue to be reported from ongoing strikes in various parts of the country, including residential areas. These strikes are also complicating aid efforts. The movement of aid workers have been scaled back, particularly to parts of Homs. The damage to border crossings has forced trucks to take longer routes, contributing to increased costs for commodities. Ongoing hostilities have also affected people's movement and response efforts in other locations. An NGO worker, for example, was injured in hostilities in Aleppo Governorate. It is critical to take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm, including to aid workers. Mr. President, in total, more than 540,000 people have now reportedly fled to Syria from Lebanon since late September, more than 500,000 people. An estimated 2/3 are Syrian. More than half of this number are children. Over 7,000 are pregnant women, and about 40% of arriving households are headed by women. The key needs of those arriving to date include food, household items, shelter, health assistance, protection, and legal support. United Nations agencies are working alongside the Syrian Arab Crescent, Red Crescent, and other partners to provide their basic needs at the border and at places of onward movement. Our colleagues from UNHCR, as the Deputy Special Envoy has said as well, are monitoring and assessing those in need. However, since the launch of the $324 million UNHCR-led interagency appeal in early October, we have received only $55 million, or that's what's projected in the pipeline. Humanitarians are doing what we can, including with existing resources on hand. But this is not sustainable in a country where 16.7 million people, more than 70% of the population, are already in need of assistance. While we welcome the contributions made to date, while we are grateful to donors for their generosity, we urge donors to step forward with more funding. There are already reports of some Lebanese families returning to Lebanon due to lack of services and poor living conditions in Syria. UNHCR is continuing to monitor the situation, which further illustrates the impossible decisions displaced people are often faced with. Mr. President, more than 100,000 people have arrived in the northeast of Syria. This is adding to needs in a region where 3/4 of the population already requires humanitarian assistance and where conflict and other drivers of needs continue. Late last month, an escalation in hostilities in the northeast killed or injured dozens of civilians. Damage to civilian infrastructure disrupted access to water, electricity, and fuel for hundreds of thousands of people. And several humanitarian partners were forced to temporarily suspend their activities. The region is also facing an emerging outbreak of suspected cholera, with over 270 suspected cases and 1 death reported to date in the northeast. Many of these cases are in Al-Hol camp, where tens of thousands of people, again, most of them women and children, are living in crowded detention-like conditions. The lack of adequate testing facilities in Al-Hasaka, along with declining resources for health services, poses a serious risk to containing the cholera outbreak. Meanwhile, an estimated 7,800 people fleeing Lebanon have arrived in northwest Syria, where needs, displacement, and civilian casualties are already high as a result of hostilities. Mr. President, members of the Council, already facing staggering levels of need and overstretched humanitarian services, host communities are pressed even further. Our partners have described a family in Homs that was already facing severe food insecurity, hosting some 20 family members who have fled Lebanon. Or a classroom in Aleppo, designed for up to 45 students, now overflowing with more than 70 children. These are communities where humanitarian assistance has already had to be dramatically scaled back. Funding for the humanitarian response plan stands at only 28%, and about 2 million fewer people are receiving critical aid each month now, more than a year ago. The impact on food security is particularly alarming. Nearly 13 million people already facing food insecurity in Syria. This is the 5th highest total globally, while the WFP has been forced to reduce its assistance by 80% in the past 2 years due to funding cuts. Worryingly, the latest Hunger Hotspots report issued by the World Food Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization identifies Syria as a country of very high concern among the 12 countries most at risk for further deteriorating conditions in the coming 6 months. As the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Syria and the regional humanitarian for the Syria crisis warned in a joint statement last week, unless more funding is received, consequences will be dire. More funding is needed to help some 2.5 million people withstand the winter months which are setting in. The situation is particularly serious for displaced people in camps and informal sites. In northwest Syria, some 1.4 million internally displaced persons require urgent assistance, including 730,000 people still living in tents. Again, women and children who make up majority of these people stand to suffer the most. Without additional funding, respiratory infections and hospitalizations are likely to surge, particularly among young children, even as health assistance has been scaled back. And millions of children will lose out on school due to lack of heating. Mr. President, the serious limitations on resources have make direct and efficient humanitarian assistance via all available routes even more essential. In this regard, I welcome the government of Syria's extension of permission, as the Deputy Special Envoy also highlighted, for the United Nations to use Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings to deliver assistance from Turkey to northwest Syria until 13 February 2025. The cross-border operation is a critical lifeline for nearly 1 million people a month in Idlib and northern Aleppo. Funding shortfalls also reinforce the importance of strengthened investments in early recovery assistance under the Humanitarian Response Plan and the new early recovery strategy. For example, investing in rehabilitating irrigation systems will allow for greater food production and expand agriculture livelihoods. Critical, given this year's wheat harvest is expected to be nearly 50% below the pre-crisis level. Critical also because of the food insecurity numbers I shared earlier. Similar interventions are needed in health, water, education, and energy sectors, all of which have been decimated by years of conflict and crisis. Finally, Mr. President, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria underlines the importance of sustained progress towards peace in Syria and across the region. We once again urge for support for the Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to facilitate a political solution in Syria, an essential step towards ending this decade-long humanitarian crisis and enabling the people of Syria to rebuild their lives and restore hope for a better future. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wosornu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Sorsan Abu Zainuddin.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, 13 years ago, we, brave Syrian women and men, took to the streets claiming what's rightfully ours, a say in how we live and how our country is governed. Our message was clear. Syria
is ours, and it is not the property of the Assad
family. 13 years on, thousands continue to demonstrate in the streets of Sweda, undeterred by intimidations. For over a year now, they have been asserting that Syria is ours and is not the property of the Assad family, or, for that matter, any of the de facto authorities that have emerged in the past 13 years. Protesters in Idlib, Aleppo, Qamishli, and Deir ez-Zor, and beyond, echo this sentiment. In the years between these two moments, hundreds of thousands of us have been killed. Tens of thousands forcibly disappeared or tortured to death, and millions have been displaced. Those who remain live in a fragmented Syria, ruled by de facto authorities, including that of the Assad regime, who rules by force and not by legitimacy. But I'm not here today to recount atrocities you know very well, nor am I here to stir your emotions or appeal to your sense of humanity. We are beyond that. I am here today to say that we are invincible, even in the face of your contentious politics. And I'm going to explain why and propose that we leverage this determination to break the political deadlock that we all face. Members of the Council, let's speak accountability. When Russia and China vetoed this Council's resolution to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court in 2014, we persisted. We found creative workaround to the limitations imposed by this Council's political dynamics. Our documentation and advocacy led to the creation of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the first UN accountability mechanism of its kind. And this paved the way for all of us to use universal jurisdiction to pursue accountability. Thanks to the relentless efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders, including women-led groups, today, perpetrators are facing trials in the courts of the world, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in the US, and in the UK. And thanks to the same efforts, the Netherlands and Canada brought Syria to the International Court of Justice. And members of the Council, exactly a year ago, in November 2023, the ICJ issued a landmark ruling demanding Syria end torture, a call the regime has blatantly ignored. And as Syrians stood outside the ICJ that day demanding accountability, they were still fighting for the creation of the independent institution on missing persons, for their right to truth and justice. And yes, they did have the General Assembly establishing that last year. On chemical weapons, a crime that shocked the world, we didn't give up either. Despite Russia's repeated vetoes, our determination to seek justice remains persistent. In fact, tomorrow in The Hague, Syrian civil society will host members of the international community in our second conference on chemical weapons, where we will highlight progress in this regard. Our collective efforts, the collective efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders have led to two historic developments. First, the international arrest warrants for Bashar al-Assad and others, holding them accountable for their role in the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This marks the first ever warrant issued by a foreign court against a sitting head of state for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a groundbreaking precedent. And second, the first of its kind working group to advance proposals for criminal accountability for chemical weapon use, consisting of states from nearly every region of the world coming together to say no to impunity. Members of the Council, the political dynamics have also hindered access for millions of Syrians to aid, but not our will to act. After last year's earthquakes, it took a week for the UN to secure the Syrian government's permission and approval to open border crossings into northwest Syria. An entire week when every second counted. During that critical time, our own white helmets, alongside tens of humanitarian Syrian organizations and voluntary groups, were the only responders. We did our utmost when the United Nations of this world hesitated, despite legal scholars affirming that it had the authority under international law. But politics prevailed. And then came the Russian vetoes to end cross-border aid altogether, pushing the UN to a consent-based model, granting the Syrian regime power over aid delivery across Syria. This is a regime with a track record of deadly sieges, of obstructing cross-line aid, of tampering with humanitarian convoys, stripping them of life-saving medical supplies. A regime notorious for its innovative methods of aid diversion has been, in practice, granted a de facto veto power over Syrians' right to humanitarian assistance by this Council's politics. So yes, it is all politics. Yet, on the one issue that requires political resolve and diplomatic ingenuity, this Council remains paralyzed. Members of the Council, I'm speaking of Resolution 2254. For 13 years, the international community has complicitly politicized every technical aspect of the Syrian conflict, empowering the regime and leading Syria into a political stalemate. Meanwhile, it has depoliticized the conflict root causes, fueling calls to normalize with this narcotic regime under the guise of pragmatism and humanitarian necessity. Resolution 2254, born in this very chamber in 2015, has been systematically undermined by your passive approach to the conflict's political core. Let's not forget, Syria's conflict did not emerge from a vacuum. It began with a regime massacring its own people, the same regime you're thanking today for opening borders and crossing points. Today, the political process is stalled, reduced to a futile constitutional path, and worse, it's diluted by multiple trajectories regionally and internationally to normalize with the regime. But it's in this context that Madaniya came into being, a collective of over 200 organizations with members and representatives present with me here today, working across all regions inside Syria and across all sectors, inside Syria and the diaspora, and coming together to reclaim political agency to our civic space. Not to replace any of the Syrian bodies engaged in the political process, but to assert our rightful role as civic actors in shaping the political future of our country. And to propose that we use all leverage to incentivize a genuine political solution. Members of the Council, two files, early recovery and refugee return, are critical here. While sustainable aid through early recovery is overdue, entrusting the Syrian regime with it undermines efforts for political progress. You are tampering with power dynamics on the ground. You are supposed to be exerting pressures on the regime to cooperate in the political process, not granting it critical files to fortify its grip of power over the lives of Syrians. Early recovery should build the foundations of a principled state, not restore a criminal regime. Support must invest in building and bridging local institutional infrastructure, including that of Syrian civil society, across all regions, based on a human rights conditionality, to rebuild Syria as a whole on a foundation of sovereignty and national ownership claimed by its own people, not by regimes who hold power through the rule of repression and violence. Similarly, refugee return must be voluntary, safe, and dignified. Yet, Some member states misrepresent forced displacement as voluntary returns, portraying Syria as safe and using displacement as a tool for normalization. Those fleeing Israeli attacks in Lebanon or deported from neighboring countries are not returning home. They are being forcibly displaced. This demands a nuanced response, ensuring support and protection to those in need while addressing the root causes to create conditions for a voluntary return. And how so? By incentivizing the political process. Members of the Council, I will leave you with 3 messages. First, stop tampering with power dynamics through your passive political approaches. Your inaction is undermining Resolution 2254, empowering war criminals and worsening the situation, not just for us, but for the region, the international order, and ultimately for you. Second, leverage technical files to incentivize political progress. Demand irreversible concessions that can push the political process forward. Aid and accountability have been politicized to empower the Syrian regime for long. It's time that you ask how they can be used to shift power dynamics in favor of the Syrian people. And finally, work with us. We are the stakeholders in the future of Syria. We are the future of Syria. Any political settlement that's concluded at our expense, that denies our rights and dignity, will inevitably fail, because we will not rest until we claim back our state of citizenship and democracy.
I thank Ms. Abu Zainuddin for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Прежде чем я начну свое
Before I
выступление,
start my statement,
я хотел бы
I
высказать
would
глубокое
like
сожаление тем,
to
что
express deep
британское
regret that
председательство
the UK presidency,
в присущем Лондоне неоколониальном духе
with the neo-colonial spirit that is
пошло
present
на
in
сознательную
London,
политизацию нашего заседания
sought deliberately to politicize our
и
debate.
прямую провокацию,
This is a direct provocation.
пригласив докладчика,
By
которым
inviting
движут
a
исключительно
rapporteur
комплексы,
who is just putting forward a purely complex,
фантомные боли
phantom-like
и соображения мести своим соотечественникам,
about the situation regarding her compatriots,
успешно налаживающим мирную жизнь под руководством
people
законного
who
сирийского
are
правительства.
successfully living their lives in peace under the leadership and control of the Damascus authorities.
Мы имели прекрасную
We
возможность
have had an
убедиться, что
excellent
данный
opportunity
докладчик
to believe that this particular
не имеет ни
rapporteur
малейшего понятия о том,
has
что на самом
no
деле происходит в
understanding
Сирии.
whatsoever of what is currently going on in Syria.
Это грубое неуважение
This
к членам
is a
Совета
gross lack of respect
и
for the members of
пренебрежение
the Council,
принципами,
and it's a
на которых
disdain
должен
for the
работать Совет
principles
Безопасности ООН.
that should underpin the work of the UN Security Council.
Мы выражаем вам решительный
We
протест по этому
would
поводу.
like to express our sincere protest against this,
Будем требовать
and
объяснений,
we are going to ask for explanations.
а также призываем не
And
забывать,
also, we would urge you not to forget
что Совет
that the
Безопасности
Security
ООН
Council of the United Nations
– это не собственность,
is not one's
уверовавшей
own
в свою исключительность и безнаказанность
area where there is impunity reigning,
семьи обнаглевших англосаксонских неоколонизаторов.
or a family that can just push forward the views of the Anglo-Saxons alone.
Обнаглевших не англосаксонских колонизаторов.
So, pushing forward the views of these blinded Anglo-Saxon colonials.
Благодарим заместителя
We would like
спецпосланника
to thank the
генсекретаря
Deputy
ООН по
Special
Сирии
Envoy of the
Najat
Secretary
Rochdi
General for
и
Syria,
директора
Najat
по операциям
Rochdi, and the
КПВ
Director
Edam
of the
Wosornu
OCHA
за представленный обзор политической и гуманитарной
for
ситуации в
their
Сирийско-Арабской
view
Республике.
of the political and humanitarian situation in the Syrian Arab
К сожалению,
Republic.
приходится
We
констатировать,
have to note
что
with
дружественная нам
regret
Сирия
that
все больше
Syria, our
оказывается
friendly
втянута
country, is increasingly
в
finding
расширение
itself
конфронтации
dragged into an
в
expanded
зоне
confrontation
арабо-израильского
in the
конфликта.
area of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Это подтверждают и
This
только
has
что
been
выслушанные нами
confirmed by
доклады.
what we have just heard from the reports today.
Армия обороны Израиля продолжает наносить интенсивные произвольные удары по объектам гражданской инфраструктуры, в том числе жилым зданиям. 20 ноября по меньшей мере 36 человек погибли, более 50 пострадали в результате израильского удара по сирийской Пальмире. Вследствие авианалетов ВВС Израиля 14-15 ноября в столичном районе Меззе и пригороде Кудсая погибли 15 сирийцев, включая женщин и детей. 16 получили ранения. Прискорбно, что в рамках комплексной поддержки Западного Иерусалима США задействуют свои военные контингенты в Ефрате и Оттанке, незаконно находящиеся там под предлогом борьбы с терроризмом. Удручающие перспективы этой борьбы усугубляются подходами западных стран к ситуации в Идлибе, находящимся под контролем листированных Советом Безопасности ООН боевиков Хейат Тахрир аль-Шам.
This is a listed group by the UN Security Council.
Политика Вашингтона нацелена на сохранение фактической оккупации обширных районов на северо-востоке Сирии и разворовывание ее богатых нефтегазовых и сельскохозяйственных ресурсов ведет к дальнейшему ухудшению социально-экономической ситуации и активизации экстремистского подполья Сирийской Арабской Республики. Так, по поступающей информации, террористы Хейат Тахрир аль-Шам вновь активизировали планы по подготовке атак против Дамаска и организации провокаций, в том числе с применением химического оружия. Как и ранее, террористы действуют по наводке западных спецслужб, к которым теперь присоединились и спецслужбы киевского режима. Спецслужбы киевского режима. По-прежнему убеждены, что выход на стабилизацию Сирийской Арабской Республики возможен исключительно через окончание иностранного военного присутствия, осуществляемого в нарушении суверенитета и территориальной целостности Сирийской Арабской Республики и прекращение авиаударов по сирийской территории. Уважаемые коллеги, как нам сегодня подтвердили докладчики, гуманитарная обстановка в Сирии остается крайне тяжелой. Более 70% населения нуждается в помощи. Уровень недоедания за последние 5 лет утроился, а стоимость жизни только за последний год возросла в 2 раза. Доступ населения к водоснабжению и чистой питьевой воде оставляет желать лучшего, в связи с чем серьезную обеспокоенность вызывают зафиксированные случаи выявления холеры в отдельных регионах Сирии. Все это свидетельство непростого процесса восстановления страны. Поток беженцев, спасающихся от военных действий Израиля в Ливане, не добавляет оптимизма и ложится тяжелым бременем на власти Сирии. За последние 2 месяца в страну въехало более 540 тысяч ливанцев и сирийцев, большинство из которых бегут именно на подконтрольной Дамаску территории. Это наглядно иллюстрирует то, что люди видят себя в безопасности там, где царит закон, а не террористические порядки и анархия. Цифры говорят сами за себя, как бы наши западные партнеры не пытались представить ситуацию иначе. Приветствуем усилия сирийского правительства и местных общин, которые делают все возможное для обеспечения базовых потребностей прибывающих. Упрощены правила въезда, развернуты центры временного размещения, проводится работа по налаживанию обучения. Местные власти помогают ООНовцам и неправительственным организациям беспрепятственно работать на погранпереходах. Что касается более широкого гуманитарного контекста, то здесь также четко прослеживается желание сирийских властей помогать всем сирийцам без исключения, в том числе тем, кто находится в неподконтрольных районах. Так, Дамаск вновь продлил до 13 февраля разрешение на использование погранпереходов Баб-ас-Салям и Ар-Рай для завоза помощи из Турции. Баб-аль-Хава также продолжает работать. Мы призываем гуманитарные организации УКГВ и секретариат ООН учитывать конструктивный подход Дамаска и усилить работу по оказанию необходимой помощи, в том числе в приеме беженцев. Важно, чтобы структуры ООН укрепили взаимодействие с местными органами власти, максимально координировали с ними на земле в полном соответствии с известными международно признанными гуманитарными принципами. Нет места политизации, когда речь идет о помощи людям, об их праве на развитие и достойную жизнь. Гуманность, беспристрастность, нейтральность, независимость, координация, принцип согласия. Вот на чем должна зиждиться работа ООН. Тем более, что власти Сирии не только открытым текстом заявляют о готовности выстраивать взаимодействие именно на такой основе, но и на деле доказывают это. Пока мы, к сожалению, не видим у ООН каких-либо прорывов на этом направлении. Кросс-лайн-маршруты доставки гуманитарной помощи до сих пор не налажены. Работа с донорами не приносит должных результатов. Призыв профинансирован лишь на 28%. Не пересмотрена и позорная для ООН внутрисекретариатская методичка, параметры и принципы гумсодействия в Сирии, подыгрывающие антидамасскому нарративу в западных странах. При этом отмечаем, что секретариат ООН опубликовал новый, весьма неоднозначный по своему содержанию документ «Стратегия раннего восстановления Сирии на 2024-2028 годы», который в первом приближении обходит необходимость получения согласия сирийцев на реализацию соответствующих проектов на территории их собственной страны. Вместо этого в документе имеются отсылки к тому, что ООН закрепляет за собой право заключать контракты с любыми местными партнерами и привлекать финансирование в два раздельных фонда для правительственных территорий и неподконтрольных районов. Нам еще предстоит проанализировать, как эта стратегия может сказаться на гуманитарной работе ООН в Сирии. Свои оценки мы представим дополнительно. Еще один аспект, который напрямую связан с бедственным положением миллионов сирийцев, связан с развязанной против Сирии санкционной травлей. Мы вновь призываем представителей ООН не замалчивать факт негативного влияния незаконных ограничений на социально-экономическое положение страны. В этой связи приглашаем всех принять участие в заседании Совета Безопасности ООН по формуле АРИА, которую Россия проводит 25 ноября по теме «Гуманитарные последствия односторонних принудительных мер». Уважаемые коллеги, наша позиция по вопросу сирийского регулирования неизменна. Выступаем за строгое соблюдение положений резолюции Совета Безопасности ООН 2254, предполагающей политический процесс, осуществляемый самими сирийцами при посредничестве ООН, альтернативы которому не существует. Последовательно исходим из необходимости продолжать прямой межсирийский диалог в рамках Конституционного комитета, работа которого остается заблокированной в результате возникших трудностей с подбором места проведения встречи. Убеждены, что определить такую площадку должны сирийцы в взаимодействии со спецпосланником Генсекретаря ООН по Сирии и в координации со странами-гарантами астанинского формата – Россией, Ираном и Турцией. В этой связи хотели бы привлечь внимание к итогам 22-й международной встречи по Сирии в Астане, проведенной с нашими партнерами по астанинскому процессу Ираном и Турцией 11-12 ноября. В ходе нее, в частности, была вновь подчеркнута ведущая роль данного формата в продвижении устойчивого и долгосрочного регулирования сирийского кризиса на фоне эскалации напряженности на Ближнем Востоке. Кроме того, на полях
Furthermore, on
заседания
the sidelines of the
состоялась
meeting,
очередная встреча
there
рабочей
was
группы
another meeting
по
of the working
освобождению
group on
задержанных
the release
заложников,
of detainees and hostages,
передаче тел
and
погибших
on the
и
transfer of
поиску
bodies of those
пропавших
who
без
died,
вести.
and on the search for the missing.
Будем продолжать
We will
работу с
continue to
партнерами
work with our
по Астане
partners in the Astana format
в интересах
in the
комплексной
interest
стабилизации
of a
ситуации в
comprehensive
Сирии и вокруг
stabilization
нее.
of the situation in Syria and surrounding
Благодарю за
Syria.
внимание.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and Director Wosornu, for your briefings. And Ms. Zainadine, thank you for your powerful and precise presentation. Your remarks will resonate in this chamber for some time to come. I hope the Assad regime's puppet masters were listening carefully. And as we've heard, the truth clearly struck a nerve. The United States remains deeply concerned about the plight of vulnerable individuals, Syrian, Lebanese, and otherwise, who have been displaced by the current conflict in Lebanon. We are closely monitoring their well-being and treatment, and we applaud the work of UN agencies and other humanitarian partners who are doing their utmost to provide aid to those in need. At the same time, we are concerned by ongoing reports of the Assad regime's abuses, including against Syrians displaced from Lebanon, of Syrians who have faced arbitrary detentions, disappearances, forcible conscription, and death while in regime custody, reportedly due to torture. We are also concerned with the escalation of Russia-backed attacks in northwest Syria that have killed and injured scores. These human rights violations and abuses demonstrate that the regime, which has a long history of oppression, has not changed its ways and is seeking to rehabilitate its image by exploiting humanitarian disasters and regional crises. The reality, colleagues, is that Syria remains unsafe and unsuitable for large numbers of returns. We must reject the flawed notion that certain parts of the country are safe for large-scale returns. The best way to enable the voluntary return of refugees is for the Assad regime to create the conditions needed for return, which will require bold political leadership and inclusive political processes. This includes the elimination of Law 10, as well as accountability for the missing and detained, among others. Refugees must not be expected to return until they see a safe future for themselves and their children. In the meantime, we continue to support UNHCR's efforts to improve the protection environment in Syria for over 500,000 people it estimates have crossed from Lebanon since late September. As we continue important work to help the most vulnerable refugees, internally displaced persons, and host communities, we once again urge other donors to help fill the significant funding gaps. It is worth repeating that the U.S. sanctions program against the Assad regime contains numerous exemptions and licenses specifically to facilitate humanitarian aid, and that we are committed to working with humanitarian partners to mitigate unintended impacts on their programs. We would also point to Resolution 2664, which established a humanitarian carve-out across UN sanctions regimes. This resolution was an important step forward to ease the delivery of food, medicine, and humanitarian aid to those most afflicted in conflict zones around the globe, while upholding robust sanctions. We are compelled to make this point because the regime and certain council members falsely claim on a repeated basis that U.S. sanctions are the primary cause of Syrians' economic suffering, when in fact it is the Assad regime's war against its own people, destruction of Syria, and long-term and pervasive corruption that only benefits the elites. Separately, we wish to highlight persistent needs at Al-Hol and Raj displaced persons camps, as well as at detention facilities in northeast Syria, housing former ISIS fighters. There are still 42,500 displaced persons and 9,000 foreign terrorist fighters currently residing at those camps and facilities. Ultimately, the only long-term durable solution to the challenges of these displaced persons camps and detention facilities is the repatriation or return of both displaced and detained persons to their areas or countries of origin. Only there can they be effectively rehabilitated and reintegrated into their communities and, where appropriate, prosecuted. Turning to the political process, we continue to support Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to advance it. To that end, we reiterate that U.S. sanctions will remain in place until there is, at a minimum, concrete, measurable progress toward a political solution in line with Resolution 2254. We underscore this point again and again because we want to see an authentic and sustainable political process. We stress once again that the Assad regime must curb the destabilizing activities of Iran and its proxies in the region. It is telling that instead of sitting down with the opposition and forging peace, the regime prefers to lend out its own country to Hezbollah and other terrorists. It is time for Assad to focus on the needs of his own people, rather than his sponsors in Tehran who wish to use Syria as a launching pad. The United States will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself from threats in Syria. To prevent further escalation and expansion of conflict in the region, the United States will continue working with our diplomatic partners toward resolving tensions. And finally, Mr. President, with regard to charges from some about Western exploitation of Syrian oil and other natural resources, these allegations are patently false. Syria's natural resources are there for the benefit of the Syrian people. The United States neither seizes nor sells any Syrian oil, wheat, or other commodities, including from northeast Syria, where our troops are present. To the contrary, the United States has provided millions of dollars worth of assistance to communities across northeast Syria, helping them restore essential services, generate livelihoods, and build businesses. In fact, it is the regime that owes an explanation to the Syrian people about how its natural resources have been misused. It is they who should explain why the proceeds of the country's sovereign wealth end up not in the hands of average citizens, but in Moscow and Tehran. It is they who should explain why virtually any successful business in regime areas gets shaken down for bribes or forcibly sold off to regime cronies. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'envoyé spécial adjoint Najat Rochdi et la directrice des opérations et du Bureau des affaires humanitaires de l'ONU, Edam, Wosornu, pour leurs interventions. Je prends également note de l'exposé de Mme Saousan Abou-Sain Edine. La Suisse soutient l'engagement des représentantes et représentants de la société civile dans le processus politique et en faveur de la réconciliation entre Syriennes et Syriens. Un engagement pour la paix à tous les niveaux est en effet nécessaire. La Suisse condamne l'escalade de violence en cours et le fait que de plus en plus de civils et de biens à caractère civil soient touchés par des bombardements ou d'autres types d'attaques sur l'ensemble du territoire syrien. Il faut mettre fin à cette spirale de violence. La Suisse s'engage pour que toutes les parties au conflit respectent leurs obligations en vertu du droit international, y compris du droit international humanitaire. Cela comprend en particulier les principes de distinction, proportionnalité et précaution dans la conduite des hostilités. Les violations graves du droit international en Syrie ne doivent pas rester impunies. La Suisse se joint aux appels de l'envoyé spécial contre l'extension en Syrie des hostilités en cours au Proche-Orient et au Liban voisin, ainsi que pour une résolution durable du conflit sur la base de la résolution 2254. Nous prenons note des récentes déclarations des États garants d'Astana en faveur d'une telle solution, une reprise prochaine des travaux du comité constitutionnel, ainsi que la mise en place d'un cessez-le-feu à l'échelle nationale enverrait des signaux cruciaux en ce sens. Enfin, le droit de savoir des proches des personnes disparues en raison des conflits armés Finally, the right of relatives to know the fate of missing persons as a result of armed conflict is a rule firmly anchored in the Geneva Conventions. It is also an essential element in achieving lasting peace in Syria. The independent institution for missing persons based in Geneva, whose mandate is strictly humanitarian, must be able to begin its work rapidly in collaboration with the Organization of Relatives of Detained and Missing Persons and with all actors concerned in Syria and at the international level. Mr. President, after 13 years of conflict, the situation continues to deteriorate. Syrians are paying the price. Unfortunately, as the months go by, the humanitarian situation continues to worsen. Food insecurity, access to health care, essential needs are constantly on the rise. In the coming months, these needs will be exacerbated by the harsh winter. At the same time, the intensification of violence throughout the country is challenging the work of humanitarian actors on the ground. Face à ces besoins aigus, toutes les modalités d'accès aux personnes dans le besoin, à travers les lignes de front, à travers les frontières et à l'intérieur de la Syrie, doivent être exploitées. Nous saluons la poursuite des opérations humanitaires de l'ONU via les points de passage de Bab el-Salam et d'El-Rey, dont l'utilisation a été autorisée pour 3 mois supplémentaires. Nous appelons le gouvernement syrien à prolonger ces autorisations, y compris celles pour Bab el-Hawa, sans limite dans le temps. Cela afin de garantir la prévisibilité nécessaire pour un engagement humanitaire intégral et efficace, et parce qu'il s'agit d'une obligation selon le droit international humanitaire. Par ailleurs, la poursuite des opérations militaires d'Israël au Liban a déjà entraîné la fuite de plus d'un demi-million de personnes vers la Syrie. La Suisse appelle à ce que tout soit mis en œuvre pour leur protection. Ces personnes ainsi que les communautés d'accueil, parmi lesquelles elles trouvent refuge, sont très vulnérables. À cet effet, la Suisse appelle le gouvernement syrien et les principaux acteurs humanitaires à apporter un soutien et une protection accrue aux déplacés comme aux communautés hôtes. La population syrienne doit bénéficier d'une aide humanitaire inconditionnelle et dépolitisée. À cet égard, je suis heureux de confirmer que la Suisse contribue à hauteur de plus d'$1 billion pour la Syrie à l'appel interagence d'urgence de l'ONU qui s'ajoute à son engagement régulier. Monsieur le Président, le monde nous a laissé tomber 2 fois, nous les Syriens, a déclaré Ismaël Nasser, Syrien de 35 ans, ayant fui la Syrie il y a 13 ans, et le Liban en octobre. Nous avons le devoir de ne pas les abandonner une fois de plus. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Deputy Envoy Rochdi and Director Wosornu for their briefings. I would also like to thank Mrs. Zainedine for her valuable contribution today. Mr. President, the ongoing tense and violent situation across many fronts in Syria is highly worrying, especially in combination with the escalation of violence in the wider region. The war in Gaza and the ongoing hostilities in Lebanon in particular. We urge all major stakeholders to redouble their efforts towards regional de-escalation in the interest of long-term peace and stability for all. In this growing regional turmoil, the implications for Syria and Syrians are alarming. Moreover, this is happening on our watch. Once again, tens of thousands of Syrians, many of whom have been displaced multiple times, are fleeing for their lives. Once again, they're forced to relive the nightmare of displacement, despair, and uncertainty. Most of those who are returning back to Syria are doing so under aversive conditions and extreme pressure. These people, women, children, and older persons in particular, are in a situation of acute vulnerability and have immense and urgent needs. In light of the situation unfolding, we call on the Syrian government to prioritize the welfare of all people on its territory with no distinction between them on religious, sectarian, ethnic, or political grounds. Enhancing cooperation with UNHCR would be a necessary step in order to ensure full humanitarian and protection needs for all. We call also on the Syrian government and de facto authorities on the ground to ensure long-term safety of the returnees. Mr. President, the Syrian crisis remains one of the world's worst and most enduring humanitarian situations. The current displacement influx from Lebanon adds an additional strain on the response. Almost 17 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. On top of that, with only a month left in the year, the humanitarian response plan for Syria is only at 28%, as mentioned by Director Wosornu earlier. We echo the appeal of humanitarians to urgently and significantly increase support for humanitarian efforts in Syria. In addition, to cope with the scale of the situation, all forms of aid delivery, including cross-border aid and aid delivered across the front lines, remain crucial. Humanitarian actors need greater predictability to plan their activities, and they must be able to conduct their work safely. As the situation is becoming more dangerous and unpredictable with each passing day, we call on all actors, Syrian and international, including Israel, to comply with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reiterate our full support to Special Envoy's efforts, and we call on the Syrian government to engage in a political process towards a sustainable and comprehensive political solution in line with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Deputy Special Envoy Ms. Rochdi and OCHA Director Ms. Wosornu for their informative briefings. I also thank Ms. Sosan for her very powerful remarks. The conflict in Lebanon that has escalated since September continues to have a profound impact on Syria, with 540,000 Syrians and Lebanese reported to have entered the country, 75% of whom are women and children. In addition, Israeli airstrikes on targets inside Syria have escalated, resulting in an increase in civilian casualties. Conflict in Gaza and Lebanon must not spill over into the entire region and cause further tragedy. Japan once again calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. We also urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint and work diligently toward a diplomatic solution in order to avoid further escalation in the region. Japan has done its utmost to provide assistance to those facing difficulty. On October 29th, in response to the deteriorating situation in Syria affected by conflict in Lebanon, the government of Japan decided to provide a new emergency grant aid, which amounts to $10 million. Through this financial outlay, we will provide humanitarian assistance such as daily necessities, food, water, and sanitation through UNHCR, WFP, UNICEF, and UNDP. Mr. President, even putting the spillover from Lebanon aside, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely serious. According to the UN, contributions to the humanitarian response plan are only 28% of what was requested. As to the problems caused by Lebanon crisis, only 17% of the emergency appeal announced in September has been collected. We continue to call on all donors to provide whatever assistance they can to address urgent need of the population. If the necessary funds are not raised before winter sets in, the people of Syria could face even harsher conditions. While we must deal with other pressing issues, we must not abandon Syrian people. Mr. President, we emphasize that the only solution to the political stalemate in Syria is to advance Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. It is regrettable that more than 2 years have passed since the last meeting of the Constitutional Committee and people's expectations are waning, so we strongly urge that the meeting be held as soon as possible. In this connection, we note that the 22nd meeting of the Astana process was held in November 11 to 12 in Kazakhstan. We hope that this process will promote confidence building among the parties concerned. Also, we note that Special Envoy Pedersen is currently visiting the region, including Damascus, and we hope that meaningful discussions will take place with stakeholders. Mr. President, it is unacceptable that the tragic situation of Syrian people continues due to the deadlock in the political process. We call on all parties to resolve the conflict through dialogue so that the flames that are rising in the region can be extinguished and the Syrian people and other innocents can return to living in peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and Director Wosornu for their briefings, and I also thank Ms. Zainadine for sharing her powerful testimony with us today. The Syrian people, already profoundly vulnerable after enduring 14 years of conflict, need peace, stability, and political support more than ever. Yet, the region remains on the precipice. Just last week, airstrikes in Damascus claimed 15 lives and injured 16 more. Additional reports indicate that at least 36 people have been killed in strikes on Palmyra on Wednesday. Airstrikes in Lebanon have resulted in the displacement of nearly 500,000 people across the border into Syria. We have seen reports detailing engineering and construction work along the Alpha Line, encroaching into the area of separation. These are reported violations of the UNDF agreement. Such actions escalate tensions and potentially threaten the viability of this 50-year-old ceasefire. Mr. President, the humanitarian needs arising from Syria's protracted conflict are immense. Over 16.7 million people, including 7.4 million children, are in urgent and critical need of support. In this vein, we are deeply concerned with the humanitarian situation in northeast Syria, including reports of large-scale attacks targeting civilian infrastructure. This has resulted in disruptions to the provision of electricity and water, directly impacting civilians. We commend the efforts of the UN and its partners in reaching millions across Syria each month. Nevertheless, we regret the chronic underfunding of the humanitarian response plan. Put simply, there are no further reductions that can be made without undermining the UN's ability to respond. Urgent and increased support, particularly in early recovery, livelihoods, and resilience programming, is essential to preserve life and dignity in Syria. We stress the importance of adopting a whole-of-Syria approach in our early recovery to make sure that humanitarian aid is not weaponized by the regime. The most direct routes, both cross-border and cross-line, must be facilitated by all parties for as long as humanitarian needs persist. This is particularly critical as we approach the harsh winter months. In this regard, we welcome the renewal of the Bab al-Hawa crossing in the north for a 3-month period. Mr. President, the implementation of Resolution 2254 remains paramount. We deeply regret the continued lack of progress on this front. We once again call for the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire to be respected by all parties in the region. Without these steps, we risk a profound unraveling of the fragile foundation for peace. All parties must end their prevarications and commit to the resumption of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva. Malta reaffirms its strong support for the UN's independent institution on missing persons and emphasizes the importance of carrying out its mandate in a gender-responsive and survivor-centered manner. To conclude, Mr. President, after 14 years of war, Syria's future remains hanging by a thread. Its economy, security, and society are in ruins. While millions of Syrian people have fled to nearby Lebanon in that time, fearful of returning, we now see the fear of Israeli bombardment forcing nearly 500,000 to return. This and the threat of a major conflict in the region threaten to push Syria into total collapse. We once again reiterate that our responsibility is to stop this from happening. This is the responsibility of this Council. Those with influence over the parties must ensure that Syrian civilians are protected from devastating conflicts of an all-out regional war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Guyana. At the outset, the A3+ would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rochdi and OCHA Director Edam Wosornu for their valuable briefings. We also listened carefully to the representative of civil society. Mr. President, the escalating tensions in the Middle East is further complicating the path to peace and stability in Syria. Recent developments, including renewed violations of Syria's sovereignty, undermine Syria's fragile stability and exacerbate the suffering of its people. Such actions not only violate international law, but also risk reigniting a devastating cycle of violence and terrorism. The A3+ is deeply alarmed by these developments and underscores the urgent need for all actors in the region to exercise maximum restraint and prioritize dialogue over confrontation. Syria must be spared from further military escalation. The resurgence of terrorism within Syria serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of a comprehensive political solution to the crisis, one that ensures Syria's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process, as outlined in Resolution 2254. In this regard, we emphasize the need to reinvigorate the Constitutional Committee and call on all stakeholders to engage constructively with the Special Envoy to break the current political deadlock. We remain convinced that an inclusive dialogue among Syrians, supported by the international community, is the only viable path to a sustainable and just resolution to this protracted crisis. The A3+ calls on all parties to demonstrate the political will necessary to restore peace and stability in Syria. Mr. President, the dire humanitarian situation in Syria, exacerbated by the influx of refugees from Lebanon, has left an already estimated 16.7 million people in need, while limited funding resources further hinder efforts to address these challenges. 540,000 people have fled to Syria, a high proportion of them female-headed households, placing an additional strain on both the Syrian government and the humanitarian community, which are already struggling to meet their basic needs. The A3+ urges all parties to ensure the security of displaced persons, protect and respect their human rights, and create an environment that allows for the free movement of humanitarian organizations to reach the most vulnerable populations. We express our deep concerns over the insufficient funding for both the humanitarian response plan and the flash appeal, and call on donors to honor their commitments in this regard. The A3+ welcomes the decision of the Syrian government to extend for an additional 3 months the authorization granted to the UN and humanitarian agencies to use the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings. In this regard, we underscore the critical importance of all mechanisms, including the cross-border and cross-line mechanisms, for the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout Syria. The A3+ has consistently advocated for the urgent need for early recovery projects to ensure an effective humanitarian response. Restoring the health system must be a priority, especially in light of the suspected cholera cases in Al-Hasaka, which highlight the urgent need for action. The A3+ calls on all member states to engage positively with the UN efforts to implement an early recovery strategy, including by lifting unilateral sanctions. The future of Syrians depends on creating an environment conducive to their safe, voluntary, and dignified return to their homes. Mr. President, the Middle East stands at a critical crossroads, and we cannot afford to witness the outbreak of another conflict, particularly in Syria, which has already been ravaged by 13 years of crisis. It is imperative that we all work together to prevent the recurrence of violence in Syria and to find a lasting solution to the crisis that continues to shake the country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President.
Agradezco a la enviada especial alterna Rochdi y a la directora Wosornu por la información proporcionada. He tomado debida nota de la intervención de la representante de la sociedad civil. Saludo la presencia de los representantes permanentes de Siria, Irán y Turquía. Señor Presidente, en esta ocasión quisiera abordar nuevamente tres aspectos que preocupan a mi delegación sobre la situación en Siria. Primero, sobre el estancamiento de la negociación política y la falta de voluntad de las partes para explorar cualquier escenario alternativo, mi delegación subraya que la única solución posible para la situación en Siria es política, por lo que hoy, más que nunca, están vigentes los dispositivos de la resolución 2254. El Comité Constitucional como estrategia integral de diálogo entre el gobierno, oposición, sociedad civil y otros países interesados debe ser reactivado sin dilación. Animamos al enviado especial Pedersen a no cesar en las sesiones diplomáticas para determinar una sede alternativa para el Comité Constitucional. Segundo, se configura una nueva crisis humanitaria con el incremento en el número de personas forzadas a desplazarse entre sirios, palestinos y libaneses. El 75% de desplazados son mujeres, niños y personas con discapacidad, cuyos niveles de exposición y vulnerabilidad se incrementan frente a la exacerbación de las tensiones. Estos desplazamientos agravan la situación que enfrenta el país, donde 2 de cada 3 personas se encuentran en necesidad de asistencia humanitaria para sobrevivir. La comunidad internacional debe responder al llamamiento de emergencia de Naciones Unidas por $324 millones adicionales para enfrentar las necesidades emergentes del plan de respuesta humanitaria. Los cruces fronterizos de Bab al-Salam y Al-Rai se encuentran operativos hasta el 13 de febrero de 2025. El compromiso del gobierno sirio en esta área debe ser permanente para garantizar la predictibilidad y sostenibilidad de la asistencia humanitaria. Y tercero, las repercusiones del conflicto regional ya muestran el temido efecto contagio con la escalada de violencia en territorio sirio. Preocupa además a mi delegación la extrema sensibilidad de la situación en la región y la resistencia de las partes para hacer gala de moderación y contención. Señor Presidente, 13 años después de iniciado el conflicto en Siria y después de todos los esfuerzos de la comunidad internacional para apoyar un proceso intrasirio de establecimiento de la paz, es tiempo de darle oportunidad a la concertación, única vía para alcanzar la paz y seguridad en Siria, y desde ahí irradiar la paz a la región entera. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Mesdames Rochdi et Wosornu pour leurs interventions, ainsi que Madame Abou Zaineddine pour son exposé très éloquent et surtout pour son action en faveur du peuple syrien. Après bientôt 14 ans de guerre et le refus de Damas de prendre en compte les aspirations légitimes du peuple syrien, la perspective d'un embrasement régional qui pourrait s'étendre à la Syrie doit être évitée. Les tensions actuelles font peser de nouvelles contraintes sur les populations qui s'ajoutent à la recrudescence des actions de Daesh, le trafic de captagons et la poursuite des violences du régime et de ses soutiens contre la population. La France n'a cessé de le répéter. Un processus politique crédible, répondant aux aspirations des Syriens, reste la seule manière de parvenir à la paix. Elle réaffirme son soutien à Gare Peterson et à la mise en œuvre de la résolution 2254 dans toutes ses composantes. Elle est prête, à la condition de progrès du processus politique, à entamer la levée des sanctions et le financement de la reconstruction. La fuite de plus d'un demi-million de Libanais et de Syriens du Liban vers la Syrie montre l'impact des tensions régionales. Toutes ces personnes doivent pouvoir bénéficier d'aide et de garanties de sécurité. À cet égard, la France est préoccupée par l'arrestation et la disparition forcée et d'autres graves violations des droits des Syriens revenus du Liban. Nous devons collectivement faire pression sur le régime pour qu'il lève les obstacles
au retour des réfugiés. C'est le sens du travail engagé par la France avec le HCR et ses partenaires. La situation humanitaire reste très dégradée. L'hiver va davantage éprouver une population épuisée par plus de 13 années de guerre. Les plus vulnérables vont être touchés par le froid. Une grande partie de la population est en proie à la faim. Dans ce contexte, il est indispensable de continuer à financer l'aide, mais aussi à se mobiliser pour permettre l'acheminement de celle-ci. La France finance en 2024 un projet pilote du Programme alimentaire mondial visant à garantir un accès abordable au pain pour 250 000 personnes dans le nord-ouest. À ce titre, elle rappelle le caractère vital de l'acheminement transfrontalier de l'aide et elle appelle le régime syrien à autoriser l'utilisation sans limite dans le temps des points de passage de Bab el-Salam, Al-Rai et de Bab el-Awa. Dans le même temps, il est impératif de poursuivre les efforts pour permettre l'acheminement de l'aide à travers les lignes de front. La France rappelle que le droit international humanitaire s'impose à tous les acteurs partout en Syrie. Je vous remercie.
The representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi, Director Wosornu for their briefings. I also convey my special gratitude to Ms. Zainedine for her testimonies, which were truly inspiring. It is deeply worrisome that the security situation in Syria has further worsened ever since the last briefing. The escalation over the past week, including intense airstrike in Damascus, northeast Syria, and Palmyra, show no sign of abating. In this context, I would like to make the following 3 points. First, we reiterate our call for all parties to recommit to the political process outlined in Resolution 2254. While Syria's security landscape is deeply interconnected with regional dynamics, the political process under the resolution remains the only agreed-upon framework for achieving sustainable peace in the country. As such, we urge all parties to uphold the principles enshrined in the resolution, including the preservation of territorial integrity and the protection of the rights of all Syrians. Second, we call on Syria to provide answers to families of missing and arbitrarily detained persons regarding their fate. Ensuring the human rights of all Syrians is more crucial than ever, particularly with the anticipated arrival of more refugees from Lebanon. Yet, progress on addressing the critical issue of detained and the missing persons remains limited, despite the passage of time. In this context, we acknowledge the recent report of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, IIMP, which outlines its notable achievements since its establishment last April. We commend the IIMP for its steadfast efforts in clarifying the fate of missing persons through extensive outreach and engagement. However, it is deeply concerning that the IIMP has not yet appointed its head, despite the 6 months of operational activity. We reiterate our call for the immediate appointment of its leadership, as such progress will serve as a vital confidence-building measure and advance Special Envoy Peterson's step-by-step approach. Third, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria demands both immediate and long-term responses. A cholera outbreak, alarming food insecurity, and the approaching winter exemplify the urgent need for the international community to address the funding gap currently filled at only 28%. In this context, the Republic of Korea has contributed $26 million to support the Syrian refugees in the region and urges other donor countries to act swiftly to help mitigate escalating crisis. Furthermore, over a decade of humanitarian crisis in Syria highlights the great need for both sustainability and resilience in our efforts. In this regard, we commend OCHA's launch of the Early Recovery Strategy 2024-28, which represents a critical step toward fostering a long-term recovery of the country. In closing, my delegation calls on all parties to urgently cease hostilities, protect the civilians at all costs, and recommit to a political solution that ensures lasting peace, security, and prosperity in Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I wish to thank DSE, Rochdi, and Director Wosornu for their briefings. Over the past month, Israel has continued to carry out airstrikes against Syria, causing heavy casualties. The actions by Israel gravely violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. China expresses strong condemnation. Such actions must cease immediately. The protracted conflict in Gaza and the escalating situation between Lebanon and Israel have plunged the entire region into uncertainty and instability. In this context, the international community must work together to effectively prevent the further growth and spread of the conflict, as it will lead to even greater disasters. China calls on parties concerned to effectively respect the sovereignty, security, and the territorial integrity of Syria and immediately cease their illegal military actions against Syria. Foreign forces must end their illegal military presence in Syria as soon as possible. The rising tensions between Lebanon and Israel recently has caused an influx of more than 500,000 refugees into Syria, further exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation there. China applauds the positive actions taken by the UN agencies in their efforts to provide emergency humanitarian assistance to those in need. We welcome the Syrian government's decision to extend the authorization for the Edam border crossings and commend the government's efforts in making proper arrangement to host refugees. We call on the parties to respond positively to the urgent appeals by the humanitarian agencies such as UNHCR, scale up humanitarian input for Syria, honor the donor commitments in a timely manner, and ensure the smooth implementation of humanitarian projects in Syria so as to help improve the humanitarian situation in the country. China reiterates that the unilateral sanctions imposed against Syria by certain countries should be lifted without delay, and that the illegal plundering of Syrian resources should stop forthwith in order to create favorable conditions for the Syrian economy to recover and develop. President, China firmly supports the general direction of a political solution to the Syrian issue and the comprehensive facilitation of the political process in accordance with the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned principle. We welcome the efforts by Special Envoy Patterson in line with this principle. We look forward to the coordination among various existing dialogue mechanisms and render assistance to the political solution on the basis of communication and consultation with the Syrian government. China firmly supports the Syrian government in its efforts to fight terrorism. We call on the international community to reject double standards in accordance with international law and council resolutions and join hands in the spirit of zero tolerance to support the Syrian government in combating terrorist forces within its borders. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of the United Kingdom. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and Director Wosornu for their briefings. I would also like to thank Sorsan Abu Zainuddin for her incredibly powerful testimony today. As we have heard today from Ms. Zainuddin, there is a vibrant community of civil society actors who stand ready to support the Syrian political process, accountability efforts, and humanitarian work with dynamism and tenacity. Where members of this Council have failed to back resolutions in the interests of the Syrian people, civil society actors have stepped in, creatively unblocking issues that have regretfully become politicized. I commend their tireless work to advocate on behalf of Syrians for a better and peaceful Syria, but particularly to lend a voice to those who cannot speak up for fear of the regime. The work of civil society organizations, like Madaniya, serves as an important reminder of why so many Syrians took to the streets in 2011 and continue to protest peacefully for change. Let me be clear. We remain firm in our pursuit of a political settlement in line with Resolution 2254. We urge all parties to recommit to the political process. However, if we are to achieve lasting peace, we must make sure it empowers ordinary Syrians rather than the regime and its backers. We must actively involve and consult civil society, and I encourage you all to listen to their fresh ideas. Colleagues, in the absence of a political settlement and amidst regional escalation, the security situation in Syria is as dangerous as ever. Syrians continue to experience horrific levels of violence. As people flee from Lebanon into Syria, displaced civilians must be protected and given safe passage, not only when using border crossings, which have been subject to airstrikes, but also once inside Syria, which remains unsuitable for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns at scale. We acknowledge that Syrian authorities have allowed UNHCR and others to monitor arrivals and respond to needs. We are closely monitoring the treatment of these civilians in Syria, including deeply concerning reports of arrests. All parties must do everything possible to protect civilians and fully comply with international humanitarian law. Finally, to respond to the remarks of our Russian colleague about briefers, we invite civil society briefers to the Council to provide a civilian perspective, to speak truth to power, and to hold us all to account, no matter how uncomfortable that may feel. Representing an organisation that consults across a wide group of over 200 CSOs within and outside Syria, Ms. Abu Zainuddin has done precisely that today. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
السيد الرئيس، يواصل كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي اعتداءاته الوحشية على دول منطقتنا وشعوبها، وقد شجعه عجز مجلس الأمن عن النهوض بمسؤولياته على مواصلة وتكثيف اعتداءاته الآثمة على أراضي بلاده، حيث أصبح يستهدف بشكل شبه يومي مبانٍ وأحياء سكنية تضم مقرات وبعثات دبلوماسية ومكاتب للأمم المتحدة، كما يستهدف منشآت اقتصادية وبنى تحتية، مما أدى لاختقاء العشرات وإصابة مئات من المدنيين الأبرياء بمن فيهم النساء والأطفال، وإلحاق دمار وخسائر مادية كبيرة في الممتلكات العامة والخاصة، ناهيك عن استهداف كيان الاحتلال المتعمد للمعابر الحدودية والطرق والجسور الواصلة بين سوريا ولبنان التي يستخدمها مئات الآلاف من القادمين من لبنان هربا من آلة القتل الإسرائيلي. وفي انتهاك فاضح لاتفاق فض الاشتباك لعام 1974 تستمر قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بشن عدوانها على الأراضي السورية من جهة الجولان السوري المحتل، وقد أقدمت مؤخرا على حفر خنادق ورفع سواتر ترابية لمحاذاة خط وقف إطلاق النار في القسمين الشمالي والجنوبي من منطقة الفصل. وقد أجرت قيادة الأوندوف تحقيقات بشأن قيام قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بأعمال هندسية تشمل حفر خندق يمتد لمسافة 350 مترا وبعرض 6 أمتار، وغيرها من الانتهاكات مثل أعمال تجريف الأراضي الزراعية وشق الطرقات. لقد أبلغ وفد الجمهورية العربية السورية
الأمانة
has
العامة للأمم
informed the UN
المتحدة بهذه
Secretariat
الانتهاكات
of these violations,
كما قامت بعثة
and
الأندف
UNDOF
بتقديم
has
تقرير
reported
عنها.
on them.
واليوم
Today,
نحذر مرة أخرى
we once again
من خطورة
warn of
هذه
the
الأفعال
danger
الإسرائيلية
posed by
العدوانية
such Israeli acts
التي
of
تهدف
aggression
لخلق
aimed
واقع
at
جديد في
creating a new
المنطقة.
reality in the region.
ونتوقع رد فعل
We
مناسب
expect the
من مجلس
Security
الأمن
Council to take
يتمثل في تحركه
prompt and
الفوري
decisive action
لاتخاذ
to
إجراءات
stop the
حازمة
aggression
فورية لوقف العدوان
and put an
ووضع
end
حد
to all
لجميع
violations
الانتهاكات
and crimes
التي تقوم بها قوات
committed
الاحتلال
by Israeli
الإسرائيلي
occupation
ضد الأراضي
forces
السورية
against
وما
Syrian
يتفرع عنها
territory.
من جرائم. تلك الجرائم
The latest
التي
crime
كان آخرها
took
يوم
place
أمس
yesterday
حيث ارتكب
when the
كيان الاحتلال
Israeli
الإسرائيلي
entity launched an
جريمة مروعة
airstrike from
من خلال شنه
Al-Tanf,
لعدوان جوي
where
استهدف
US
فيه
troops
عددا من
are
الأبنية
illegally
في مدينة
present,
تدمر بالبادية السورية
targeting
وذلك
several
من
buildings
اتجاه
in
منطقة
Palmyra
التنف
and the Syrian
التي
desert,
تتواجد فيها بشكل غير شرعي قوات عسكرية
killing
تابعة للولايات
36
المتحدة
people
الأمريكية
and injuring
مما أدى
dozens,
لاستشهاد 36 شخصا في تدمر وإصابة عشرات
while
غيرهم
also
وإلحاق أضرار
causing
مادية كبيرة
significant material
بالأبنية
damage to
المستهدفة
the targeted
والمنطقة المحيطة.
buildings and surrounding areas.
إن بلاد سوريا تشدد على
The
حقها
Syrian
الراسخ
Arab Republic
في الدفاع عن
reaffirms its
سيادتها
inalienable
ووحدة
inherent
وسلامة
right
أراضيها
to defend its
واستعادة
sovereignty,
أراضيها المحتلة
unity and territorial
بكل الوسائل
integrity and
التي
to
يكفلها
reclaim its
القانون الدولي.
occupied territories, a right guaranteed
السيد
by
الرئيس،
international law. Mr. President,
يتزامن تصعيد الاعتداءات
the
الإسرائيلية
escalation
على
of
الأراضي
Israeli
السورية
acts of aggression
مع
on
تكثيف
Syrian
لهجمات
territories is
التنظيمات
coupled with an
الإرهابية
intensification
وفي
of
مقدمتها
attacks by
جبهة
terrorist
النصرة
groups,
هيئة تحرير الشام
especially جبهة
المدرجة على
al-Nusra
قائمة
هيئة
مجلس
تحرير
الأمن
الشام, listed by the
وذلك في
Security
مؤشر
Council.
واضح
This is a
على
clear
التنسيق الوثيق
indication of the organic
والترابط
ties
العضوي
and
بين
close
تلك التنظيمات
collaboration between
الإرهابية
these terrorist groups
والكيان
and the Israeli
الإسرائيلي
entity
في ارتكاب
to
الأعمال
commit criminal
الإجرامية
acts,
والاعتداءات
including
بالقذائف
shelling
والمسيرات على
civilians in
المدنيين
surrounding
الآمنين
areas with drones
في
and
المناطق
rockets.
المحيطة بأماكن تواجد تلك التنظيمات في شمال غرب سوريا
In
ناهيك عن
northern
استمرارها
eastern Syria.
بفرض
These
أيديولوجيتها
groups continue
المتطرفة
to impose their extremist
وممارساتها القائمة على
ideologies
القتل
and terrorist
والتعذيب
practices such as
والإخفاء
killing,
القسري
torture,
وتجنيد
enforced
الأطفال
disappearances,
والتمييز
child
والعنف
recruitment,
ضد النساء
and
والفتيات
violence against women
مستفيدة
and
في
girls,
ذلك من
taking
الدعم الذي
advantage of the
توفره لها
support they
بعض
receive
الدول
from
الغربية.
some Western states.
سيد الرئيس،
Mr. President,
تستمر الولايات المتحدة
the
الأمريكية
United States and
وتركيا
Turkey
بانتهاك سيادة
continue to
سوريا
violate Syrian
ووحدة وسلامة
sovereignty and
أراضيها
territorial integrity.
وميثاق الأمم
They continue
المتحدة
to violate the
والقانون
UN
الدولي
Charter and international
وذلك من
law
خلال
by
الإصرار على
insisting
استمرار
to
تواجد
maintain their
قواتهم
illegal
العسكرية
military
على
presence
الأراضي
on
السورية
Syrian
بشكل غير
soil.
شرعي إلى جانب
At
دعمهم
the same time,
لمجموعات
they are
انفصالية
supporting
وإرهابية
separatist and
ومواصلة
terrorist
سرقة
groups
الثروات
and
الوطنية
looting
السورية
Syrian national
وحرمان الشعب
resources
السوري من
at the
الاستفادة
expense of the
منها.
Syrian people.
إن بلادي سوريا
The Syrian Arab
تؤكد على
Republic
ضرورة احترام
stresses the
سيادة
need to
سوريا
respect its
واستقلالها
sovereignty,
ووحدة وسلامة
independence,
أراضيها
unity and territorial
فإنها تشدد
integrity,
على
and
ضرورة
emphasizes
إنهاء
the
أي
need for
وجود
an
عسكري
immediate and
غير شرعي على الأراضي
unconditional
السورية
withdrawal
فورا
of
ودون
all
أي قيد
foreign
أو شرط.
military forces illegally present on its
السيد
territory.
الرئيس،
Mr. President,
لقد أدى العدوان الإسرائيلي
the
الهمجي
brutal
على
Israeli
لبنان
aggression
الشقيق
on Lebanon,
إلى
on
التسبب
brotherly
بموجة
Lebanon,
نزوح
has led to
كبيرة
a massive wave of
وقد فتحت
displacement.
سوريا أبوابها
The Syrian
وحشدت
Arab
طاقاتها
Republic opened its doors
لاستقبال
and
مئات الآلاف
mobilized
من
its
الأشقاء
resources to
اللبنانيين
welcome hundreds of
والعائدين
thousands of
السوريين
Lebanese
ورعايا
displaced
الدول
persons,
الثالثة
Syrian returnees,
حيث بلغ
and
عدد
third
الوافدين إلى
country
الأراضي السورية
nationals.
حتى تاريخه
To date,
أكثر من
around
600,000 وافد
600,000 people have entered Syria,
71% منهم
71%
سوريين.
of whom are Syrians.
وتقوم الحكومة السورية
The
بالتعاون
Syrian
مع الأمم
government, in
المتحدة
collaboration with the United
ووكالاتها
Nations,
بما فيها
humanitarian
مفوضية
partners, and
اللاجئين
civil,
وأوتشا
including the UNHCR and
وغيرهم من
OCHA,
الشركاء الإنسانيين
and other
ومؤسسات
humanitarian
المجتمع
partners and
المدني
civil society
بتوفير
organizations,
كل ما يلزم
continues
من
to
خدمات
provide them
لهم
with the
رغم
necessary
التحديات
services
الكبيرة
despite the
والظروف الصعبة
significant challenges and difficult circumstances it is facing. In this vein, we call for supporting our humanitarian response efforts and providing adequate funding, while also fulfilling the relevant appeals launched by the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the large number of Syrians returning from Lebanon to Syria and the multifaceted facilitations provided by the Syrian government, which we have repeatedly explained, though some have turned a deaf ear, unequivocally refute Western claims about the return of Syrian refugees. It is high time for certain states to stop repeating such unrealistic allegations and outdated conditionalities. Syria remains committed to improving the humanitarian and living conditions of all Syrians across the country. To this end, the Syrian government renewed the authorization for the United Nations to use the Bab al-Salama and al-Rai crossings for an additional 3 months to ensure aid reaches its intended civilian beneficiaries in northwestern Syria. We emphasize the need to support the resilience of all Syrians, including returnees, through serious and tangible engagement in early recovery projects, livelihood initiatives, and the provision of essential services. We also stress the need to eliminate the adverse effects of the so-called parameters and principles of UN assistance in Syria, known as the Feltman Paper. It is completely antagonistic, and it goes against basic humanitarian principles. It deprives most vulnerable groups, particularly women and children, of adequate living conditions. Additionally, we call for the full, immediate and unconditional lifting of unilateral coercive measures which represent they are illegal and unethical, and they represent a collective punishment on Syrians and deprive them of their most basic needs. Mr. President, in its final statement, the recent Arab-Islamic summit hosted by the brotherly Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a few days ago strongly condemned Israeli aggression against Syria. It called upon the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities, take the necessary firm action to end the occupation crimes, and implement its relevant resolutions to end the Israeli occupation of Arab land, including the occupied Syrian Golan. I would also like to highlight the 22nd meeting of the guarantor states on Syria in the Asitana format, held in the capital of Kazakhstan on November 11 and 12. The final statement reaffirmed the commitment to Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. It also pledged to continue joint efforts to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, while opposing separatist agendas aimed at undermining Syria's unity and territorial integrity. The statement also condemned the repeated Israeli attacks on Syria's sovereignty. My country, Syria, reaffirms its commitment to a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political process without any foreign interference and with full respect for our sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. We reaffirm that we will continue to cooperate and engage in dialogue with the UN Special Envoy within his mandate as a facilitator. He is currently in Damascus, and he will be holding discussions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. In conclusion, Mr. President, It is unfortunate that the current president of the Security Council did not respect the procedures. It used it to serve its own agendas in an attempt to violate a member state for clear targets, namely to repel the statements and the commitment of the Syrian government, which is opening border crossings, continuing its daily work, and welcoming returnees. The second goal is to cover up for the crimes of Israel and the support provided by member states, as we have seen yesterday by the U.S. veto of the E10 draft resolution. A resolution that was supported by 14 states. This resolution would have stopped the Israeli aggression. It would have protected the rights of the Palestinian people and saved lives. The goal is clear. In Syria, we have hundreds of civil society organizations. We have thousands of courageous volunteers working night and day in partnership with the Syrian government and state institutions as well as the United Nations. We are proud of them. We are working with them to improve the humanitarian situation and living conditions of the Syrians, to provide the support needed by Syrians. Currently, we are also providing support to Syrians coming from Lebanon at the borders. They are working night and day to provide all the services necessary in line with their capacities and despite the difficult challenges. Unfortunately,
يتم التعتيم على جهودهم
their efforts are
وحرمانهم من الفرصة لعرض رؤاهم أمامكم عن التحديات التي يواجهونها
challenges they are facing on a daily basis because of the politicization of humanitarian work, because of the lack of funding, because of the coercive measures that represent a collective punishment, depriving Syrians of their most basic rights, including the right to electricity, due to the unilateral, of course, sanctions and the continuous U.S. looting of our oil. They are depriving them of their grains. These are realities. But you are not bringing whoever is working on the ground, whoever is working in the humanitarian field on Syrian soil. You are promoting
وهي ممارسة غير مقبولة تعبر عن تسييس من رئاسة المجلس لأعماله وتعبر عن انتقائية وغياب للمصداقية والحيادية.
That is not credible, that is not objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. President, the situation in Syria remains dire, exacerbated by Israeli escalating violence and aggression across the region. In coordination with terrorist group, Israeli occupying regime is deliberately pursuing a systematic policy aimed at crippling the infrastructure of Syrian Arab Republic. Relentless airstrike and systematic acts of aggression by this regime on Syrian territory have reached unprecedented level, targeting civilians and critical infrastructure. These criminal acts flagrantly violate Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, international law, and the UN Charter. Regrettably, Israel's impunity is perpetuated by unwavering U.S. support and inaction of the Security Council, as evidenced by yesterday's U.S. veto. This disgraceful veto not only highlights the Security Council failure to uphold its charter-based mandate, but also serves as a U.S.-granted license for occupying regime to continue its carnage in Gaza and Lebanon with full impunity. This has undermined humanitarian efforts and poses a grave threat to regional and global peace. We reiterate once again our call on the Security Council to act decisively to end Israeli impunity. The Council must hold Israel accountable for its violation of international law and ensure the protection of civilians. If left unchecked, Israel's ongoing crime risks igniting a catastrophic war with global repercussions. Mr. President, as highlighted in today's UN briefing, the humanitarian needs in Syria remain immense. Years of foreign occupation, terrorism, and unilateral sanctions has devastated Syria's economy. The United States and its allies persist in their failed policy of inhuman unilateral sanctions, using them as a tool for the collective punishment of the Syrian people. These actions are both illegal and morally indefensible and must be lifted immediately. Meanwhile, the United States and certain European countries, such as the United Kingdom, are politicizing humanitarian aid and abstracting international affairs to support Syrian reconstruction. These harmful policies have only prolonged the conflict and exacerbated the suffering of the Syrian people. Furthermore, Israel's relentless strikes on border crossing between Syria and Lebanon have disrupted critical aid deliveries and forced hundreds of thousands to flee. Over 500,000 people have sought refuge in Syria from Lebanon, placing overwhelming on Syrian already overstretched resources and host communities. The humanitarian response to this crisis demands urgent and substantial international support. Despite these immense challenges, the Syrian government continues to demonstrate remarkable resilience. We commend its steadfast efforts to mobilize resources for assisting refugees, including those recently displaced from Lebanon. We also welcome the Syrian government decision to extend the permission for the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai border crossing for an additional 3 months to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in northwest Syria. This decision underscores Syria's commitment to alleviating the suffering of its people despite external pressure. The international community must increase support for Syria to address the urgent needs of refugees. Early recovery projects are essential for rebuilding infrastructure and creating conditions for the safe return of refugees and displaced persons. Mr. President, terrorism remains a significant threat in Syria, particularly in Idlib, where terrorist groups continue to operate. Addressing this threat requires full respect for Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Iran remains firmly committed to the Astana process, which provides a viable framework for resolving the crisis. During the 22nd meeting of the Astana format held on 11 and 12 November in Kazakhstan, the parties reviewed the recent development in Syria and reaffirmed their steadfast commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. They underscored that adherence to these principles is essential for achieving lasting peace and stability in Syria and the broader region. Iran reaffirms its commitment to a political resolution of the Syrian crisis. A political solution led and owned by Syrians is the only viable path to resolving the Syrian crisis. Any sustainable solution must fully uphold Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the illegal presence of foreign forces, particularly U.S. forces, halt the exploitation of Syria's natural resources, and cease ongoing support by the U.S. and Israel for terrorist groups. Iran fully supports the resumption of the Constitutional Committee meeting to advance meaningful political dialogue. We also welcome the Special Envoy's active engagement with Syrian authorities, particularly his ongoing visit to Damascus, as a vital step toward fostering progress in political process. The Syrian people deserve peace, dignity, and the opportunity to rebuild their nation free from external interference. Through collective efforts, we can restore peace and stability in Syria and in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Syria remains a central and painful chapter in the ongoing crises affecting the Middle East. While the focus often shifts to emerging crises, the unresolved situation in Syria continues to demand the urgent attention of the international community. The situation in the broader region has worsened the humanitarian crisis and triggered mass displacement. Since the recent escalation of hostilities and Israel's destabilizing actions across the region, we have seen a sharp increase in displacement to Syria. More than 500,000 people have crossed from Lebanon into Syria, according to UNHCR. Alarmingly, 71% of the displaced are Syrians, with women and children making up the majority. Children alone represent over half. In such dire circumstances, the international community must shoulder its responsibilities. Yet, humanitarian efforts remain underfunded. As Director Wosornu has warned, the UN's humanitarian response plan faces critical funding shortfalls, which threaten the ability to deliver life-saving assistance. Donors must step up and avoid any further cuts to funding and support early recovery efforts. The uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian aid remains vital, particularly in view of the new waves of migration that brings an additional strain. Turkey is fully committed to facilitating these efforts and will continue to ensure assistance reaches to those in need. Mr. President, Turkey is fully committed to Syria's territorial integrity and unity. Yet, Syria's already bleak humanitarian and political situation is further aggravated by terrorism. The presence of terrorist organizations within Syria undermines the country's unity and territorial integrity while posing a direct threat to Turkey's national security. No country can stand idle by repeated terrorist attacks to its territory and people. Indeed, the October 23rd deadly terrorist attack in Ankara underscored the urgent need to root out terrorist elements in Syria. The terrorists that are members of PKK, YPG, SDF infiltrated Turkey from Syrian territory. I'd like to emphasize that Turkey is entitled to take appropriate measures against this direct and imminent threat in accordance with its inherent right of self-defense. Turkey's counter-terrorism operations exclusively target terrorists and their capabilities, and utmost care is accorded to avoid any harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. The terrorists that are members of PKK, YPG, SDF, we will continue to counter their efforts against my country. A truly unified effort is needed to combat terrorism in all its forms without distinction. Eliminating these threats is a prerequisite for achieving stability in Syria and the region. Mr. President, the escalating violence in the Middle East threatens to engulf Syria further. It is imperative to insulate Syria from additional destabilizing actions and to work collectively towards a stable and peaceful future. Turkey is fully committed to this goal. We envision a Syria where a real and sustainable national consensus is achieved, with the international community playing a constructive role. A unified security structure is achieved, the safe and dignified return of displaced Syrians are guaranteed, and regional peace is not undermined by the export of instability to neighbors. These objectives cannot be realized without the removal of all terrorist elements, including Daesh and PKK-YPG, from Syrian territory. Equally, the political process must be revitalized in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Current developments should not distract us from this ultimate goal. We continue our efforts in the Astana format, among others. We also support the efforts of UN Special Envoy Pedersen to reconvene the Constitutional Committee. Mr. President, the Syrian conflict continues to inflict immeasurable suffering. The international community must remain steadfast in its commitment to Syria. My country stands ready to support all initiatives aimed at achieving a credible political solution. We will continue to work with UN agencies and relevant stakeholders to address the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.